Hey, howdy, hey, folks. It is Mrs. Johnson with the Agri-Wisdom Channel. I just read the last chapter of The Cattle Country of Peter French by Giles French, who's not related. And we're doing FFA lullabies. Again. And like I told you in the last one, it was a really short chapter, so I'm not surprised that you're here for another one. Hopefully we're getting to the murder of this whole book, because this whole book is supposed to be about Peter French's murder, and I think we're starting to put the pieces together, and I'm pretty excited. We left on page 98, the Glens of Cinco, and so we're going to start there, and this one is also really short, so if you're not asleep by then. Oh, and the next chapter is called The Murder at Cinco. Murder! See? We're getting there, okay? So, let's do that. The Glens of Cinco. Again, page 98. In my version. Meanwhile, Dr. Hughes Glen was building his own empire in California. His farming venture expanded until 1879. He became known as the world's wheat king. The Grizzly Bear, a reputable California publication, stated that he tilled 65,000 acres of land for wheat and used 1,000 mules and several hundred men in his wheat operations. He shipped his wheat crop by steamboat from Colusa to Port Costa, Contra Costa County. There it was loaded aboard vessels and bound for Liverpool, England, and sold at that port. He did without the services of middlemen, and was considered the wheat baron of the West. Certainly, no one in the 19th century would compete with Dr. Glen in the production of wheat. His well-advertised operation made huge borrowings necessary. His reputation made them possible, and his credit was good. Occasionally, he exerted ruthless pressure on small farmers to get them to sell. Merchants were eager to know him because he was constantly buying machinery or having it built. He was in the market for ships and barges to move the million bushels of wheat he was said to grow, and for warehouses in which to store it. In politics, Dr. Glen was a Democrat, but he took little part in such affairs until 1879. In 1879, he was nominated for governor of the new Constitution Party, a descendant offshoot of the National Organization. That same year, he was also nominated for the office by the Democrats, to become the only new Constitution man to be so recognized. Some observers believed this was the result of his wealth and willingness to spend it, to obtain not only his own election, but of that of others on the ticket. Glen's own loyalties were divided between the two branches of the party. The election was unusually bitter, many regular Democrats being violently opposed to Glen's affiliation with the new Constitution group. He received almost no newspaper support. That year of 1879 proved to be a bad one for the Democrats in California. When George C. Gorman, a prominent Republican, came out for Glen, even more Democrats were alienated. But the worst came when a working man's party was organized. It attacked Glen, charging that he owned 65,000 acres of land and hired Chinamen to farm it. Anti-Chinese sentiment was high, and hiring Chinese labor was far from a political asset. The Sacramento Daily Record on August 2nd, 1879, published an editorial about Glen that could have brought no comfort to his supporters. It is a sort of model of vituperative political writing. It read in part, "During his brief and not glorious political career, he has already demonstrated a talent for shuffling and equivocating, which would not have discredited a much older politician. All who know him are convinced he prefers the cheapest labor he can get, and that he would rather have slave labor than any other. As if to cinch the argument once and for all, another editorial in the same issue on the same page read, "He lends money at 18%, that he borrowed at 9%, pays about 9 cents an hour for labor, which starts at 3:30 in the morning and goes until about 9 at night. Is not paid promptly, is paid by check, and discounted. He excludes civilization from his domain." The paper further noted that Glenn was in debt $1,200,000. The doctor undoubtedly had supporters for his candidacy, but unfortunately, not many of them were writing for newspapers. The party was split, with another candidate named White, who called himself a Democrat. However, likely because his name was so well known, Glenn did not fare too badly in the election. The winner was George G. Perkins, Republican, with 67,970 votes. Glenn received 47,562, and White 44,620. Everything considered, it was a fair showing for a newcomer in politics running as a candidate of a divided party. He managed to carry Colusa County, and his neighbors supported him. In his own Jancinco, there were but 3 votes against him. Apparently, those with a closer knowledge of the doctor's practices held different views from the Daily Record. Glenn's defeat was inevitable, but the doctor was not the type to let politics discourage him from his business affairs. He was a good example of the 19th century plunger and promoter who could direct his energy with practical shrewdness, and his energy was boundless. He crossed the country with stock on a dozen trips. When one such trip was enough for most men... He crossed the country with stock on a dozen trips, when one such trip was enough for most men. He bought the Jancinco tract and increased it, and he bought horses and mules by the hundreds. Everything he did was in a grand manner. He built the largest home, ran for the highest state office, drank immoderately, and occasionally gambled for high stakes. And he did it all on borrowed money. Though the doctor had a fine house in Jancinco, he bought a mansion for his family in Oakland at the corner of Jackson and Lake Streets, paying $65,000 for property that had reportedly cost $125,000 a few years before. The family moved to Oakland, probably delighted his daughter Ella, who was in that crossroads year of 1879, was a senior at Mills Cemetery in that same city. One likely reason for the move was that the doctor had become involved with a Mrs. C.B. Poston. He gave her a job discounting the checks of the men who, at the Sacramento Daily Record, my reading is awful right now. He gave her a job discounting the checks of the men who, as the Sacramento Daily Record noted, were paid by check. As there was no bank nearby, the only way to cash them was through her. She required a fee for the service. On one of Peter French's trips to California, with a load of cattle, he paid his usual visit to the Glens. The grandeur of their new home awed the Oregon cowmen, and the flirtatious charm of their pretty daughter captured his heart. In her imposing home at Jackson and Lake, Ella was married to Peter French, February 1st, 1883. At the ceremony, he used John William, the name his parents gave him, rather than the name Peter, which he'd called himself for 12 years. Peter French was now a man of 33, small and wiry, inexperienced with cows, if not with women, damper, unschooled, an outdoorsman, and fitted only for life there. Ella was a small, well-rounded, red-haired woman of 22, a lover of luxury, entirely unfit for hardship. Peter was interested in cattle and making money, she in spending it. It is doubtful if this young woman had more than passing interest in the finest traits of the swarthy cowman from the Steens. The gala wedding was duly noted in the San Francisco Call. Sorry about the mic. In the San Francisco Call and the Oakland Tribune followed with an account a few days later, describing the bride as a graduate of Mill Seminary and the only daughter of Dr. Hughes James Glenn, the great farmer of Colusa County, and the Democratic nominee for governor of the state in 1879. The account gave details of the beautiful parlors, richly decorated with the choicest flowers, where at 8:30 the Reverend T.H.B. Anderson read the ceremony. The bride herself was attired in a crushed quote, attired in a crushed strawberry dress of corded silk and brocaded satin, adorned with point lace and tasteful flowers, end quote. The contrast between the pair must have been great. Only a short time before, the groom had been branding calves in a dusty corral in a still unsettled part of Oregon. Guests at the wedding were nearly all Glens, but oddly enough, also present was John G. South, sometimes bookkeeper and cowhand at the P Ranch, later a businessman in the Bay Area. Peter's sister Mary was also there, but she was the only member of the groom's family in attendance. One paper said that the newlyweds were to leave on an Eastern bridal tour, but they didn't. After visiting members of both families at Jancinco and Red Bluff, the newlyweds started for Oregon country, planning to visit San Francisco and Winnemucca en route. But even before the echoes of the wedding bells died, there were predictions that the marriage would not be a success. Dun dun dun! That's the end of that chapter on page 102. And I'm going to end the video here. I hope you guys are not asleep because I'm pretty excited about this next chapter. And usually I tell you guys good night and have a good night, all the things. But I'm going to read the next chapter. So if you want a good night and, all the things, because I read to you at bedtime because that's my pattern. Go to the next video because we're going to read about the murder. Okay, bye.